think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
Beneath the grand beauty of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal history rest in silence, something unexpected was uncovered, something that would change everything for the royal family. What began as a quiet restoration project soon turned into a heartbreaking discovery. Hidden deep below the ancient stone floors lay secrets no one was ever meant to find. When young Prince George was told the truth about what had been found, tears filled his eyes. It wasn't just history they had unearthed, it was a painful mystery. So discovery could push the prince to tears? Join us to find out. The door beneath the castle. Deep beneath Windsor Castle, a team of workers moved through tunnels that had stayed silent since the war. These passages had been sealed for decades, forgotten by everyone except the castle's oldest records. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. The underground air felt heavy and damp. His lamp flickered once, then twice. He stopped walking and raised his hand. The other workers turned to look at him. Thomas stood perfectly still, feeling something strange against his face. A draft, cool air moving where no air should move. He pressed his palm against the wall. The stones felt different here, newer somehow. His fingers traced the edges where mortar crumbled like dry bread. Thomas called out to his team about his discovery. The team gathered around him. They began removing stones one by one. Each stone revealed more darkness behind the wall. After an hour of careful work, they stood back and stared. A door. Not just any door, but something ancient. The wood looked black with age, covered in carvings that caught the lamplight. Royal crests stood out clearly, symbols everyone recognized from history books, but other markings twisted between them. Strange patterns that made no sense, circles within circles, lines that curved like waves, symbols that belonged to no language any of them knew. Thomas knew they needed to call someone immediately. Nobody argued. Within hours, palace officials arrived with serious faces and clipboards. They took photographs. They measured everything. They spoke in whispers that echoed through the tunnel. The news reached King Charles. He sat in his study when the report arrived, reading it once, then reading it again. An unknown door beneath his own castle, hidden for who knows how long. The implications made him uneasy. The king ordered the area secured and insisted that no one outside the palace should know about this discovery yet. The officials nodded and left quickly. The king stood by his window looking out at the castle grounds. Secrets had a way of surfacing, especially old ones. Whatever lay behind that door had been hidden deliberately. Someone long ago had sealed it away, buried it beneath stone and time. But why? He needed to know. He needed to see it for himself. The boy who never was. King Charles descended the stone steps with Prince William beside him. Neither man spoke. The air around them felt wrong, too cold and too still for a place that should hold nothing but old stone and silence. A historian waited near the ancient door, her face tight with worry. She had spent the last 2 days studying every record, every blueprint, every document about Windsor Castle that existed in the royal archives. She told them the tunnel did not appear in any official plan. Someone had built it in complete secrecy, hidden from all records. The king and prince exchanged glances. A secret room beneath the castle meant secrets worth hiding, the kind that families buried and hoped would never surface. William stepped closer to the doorway. The darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light from their lamps. He could feel the weight of history pressing down, centuries of silence about to break. The king nodded, and they entered together. The chamber opened before them like a tomb. Dust floated in the lamplight, thick as fog. The air tasted old, untouched for decades, maybe centuries. Their footsteps disturbed layers of silence that had settled like snow. Furniture filled the space, tables and chairs carved from dark wood, their surfaces dulled by time. Sealed boxes lined the walls, stacked carefully as if someone planned to return for them. Everything looked frozen, abandoned in the middle of some urgent task. But the paintings caught their attention first. Dozens of them leaned against the walls, covered by cloth that had turned gray with dust. The fabric looked fragile, ready to crumble at a touch. William reached for the nearest one. The cloth fell away in his hands like spider webs. A face stared back at him. A young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He wore royal clothing, rich fabrics and gold trim that marked him as nobility. His eyes looked directly from the canvas with an expression both proud and sad, but nobody recognized him. The historian moved closer, studying the painting with growing confusion. She knew every royal portrait, every branch of the family tree going back centuries. This boy fit nowhere. Prince William examined the frame, turning it carefully. A small piece of paper had been attached to the back, yellow with age. The handwriting looked old, formal, and deliberate. He read it aloud, his voice quiet in the dusty chamber. Air of two worlds, protected by silence. The words hung in the air like a question that demanded answers. King Charles moved to another covered painting, then another. Each cloth revealed another portrait, a young woman with kind eyes, an older man with a stern face, a family group standing together, their faces serious for the camera of a different age. All strangers, all wearing clothes that suggested royalty or high nobility, all completely unknown to recorded history. The historian began examining the sealed boxes with shaking hands. Inside one, she found letters tied with ribbon. Another held official-looking documents with royal seals. A third contained jewelry that gleamed even under the dust. Everything suggested these people mattered. Everything pointed to importance, to status, to power. Yet history had forgotten them completely. William stood before the painting of the boy, unable to look away. Something about those eyes troubled him. They held knowledge, understanding beyond their years. As if the boy knew what would happen, knew he would be erased. He asked his father what this could possibly mean. King Charles moved through the chamber slowly, touching nothing, observing everything. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. A secret branch of the family, children born outside marriage, threats to succession hidden away to prevent conflict. But protection suggested something different. These people had been kept safe, preserved, rather than destroyed. Someone had cared enough to build this chamber, to store these belongings, to keep their memory alive even if hidden. The historian found a larger document among the papers, a family tree, hand-drawn with careful detail. It showed connections between names, dates of birth and death, marriages and children. She traced the lines with her finger, following them back through generations. They connected to the main royal line at several points, branching off and returning like threads in complex fabric. But none of these names appeared in official records. It was as if someone had carefully removed them, editing them out of history itself, while keeping this secret record hidden away. King Charles finally reached the painting of the boy. He stood before it for a long moment, his face growing pale in the lamplight dot. The resemblance struck him suddenly. Something in the shape of the face, the set of the eyes. He had seen those features before, in mirrors and photographs, in the faces of his own family. His whisper barely disturbed the dust-filled air. This shouldn't exist. The words carried the weight of implications too large to voice. If this boy shared royal blood, if these hidden people connected to the crown, then everything about the family history might be incomplete. Gaps existed where there should be none. Silences where there should be voices. William stood beside his father, both men staring at the portrait. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who decided to hide these people? When did it happen? Most importantly, why? The letters in the dark. Prince William closed the library door behind them with a soft click. The room fell into silence, broken only by the quiet rustle of old paper and the distant ticking of a clock. Princess Kate sat across from two historians, both trusted advisors who had served the royal family for decades. Between them, on the major polished table, lay the painting of the unknown boy, his eyes still holding that strange mixture of pride and sorrow. The historians had been working without rest since William brought them the discovery. Now they shared their findings, and none of it brought comfort. The first historian explained that based on the painting style, the canvas type, and the clothing worn by the boy, they had dated the portrait to the late 1800s, the Victorian era, a time of strict rules and even stricter secrets. But here the trail went cold. No birth records existed for this child, no christening announcements, no mentions in letters or diaries that survived in the royal archives. It was as if someone had systematically removed every trace of his existence from official history. Kate studied the boy's face, feeling a strange ache in her chest. Someone had loved this child enough to commission a portrait, to dress him in royal finery, to preserve his memory. Yet that same love had required hiding him away where the world would never know his name. William paced the room, his mind working through possibilities. The Victorian era had been complex for the royal family. Queen Victoria's children had married into families across Europe. Scandals were buried, inconvenient truths were erased. But erasing a child seemed beyond even those harsh standards. The second historian cleared her throat and gestured to a small wooden box on the table. Inside lay bundles of letters, their paper yellow with age, tied with faded ribbon that had once been blue. She had spent hours reading them, she explained, and they told a story of love and impossible choices. Kate untied the first bundle with careful fingers. The handwriting flowed across the pages in elegant script, the ink still dark despite the passing years. Each letter was signed with only a single initial. She began reading aloud, her voice soft in the quiet library. The writer spoke of a child with bright eyes and a curious mind, a boy who asked questions about everything, who loved stories and music. The words painted a picture of someone deeply loved, fiercely protected, but between the lines of affection ran threads of fear. The writer worried about discovery, about scandal, about consequences that would harm not just themselves but others they cared for. One letter mentioned duty to the crown. Another spoke of love that society would never accept. A third described the painful choice between personal happiness and family obligation. William stopped pacing and leaned against the desk, listening. Each letter revealed more, yet explained less. Who was E? Mother, father, guardian? And who was the child they wrote about with such tender desperation? Kate reached the middle of the bundle. Here the tone shifted. The writer described making arrangements, finding a safe place, ensuring the child would be protected. They wrote of building the hidden chamber, of sealing away belongings and portraits where they could be preserved but never found. The phrase appeared again and again, for the sake of love and duty. The historians confirmed they had found similar phrases in other letters throughout the box. Someone had faced an impossible choice and made the only decision they felt they could: hide the truth to protect everyone involved. The weekend has arrived. Prince George had come to spend time with his parents, eager to explore the castle's long corridors and hear stories about kings and queens from centuries past. But he noticed immediately that something felt different. His parents whispered in corners. They stopped talking when he entered the rooms. Papers disappeared quickly into drawers. The atmosphere held secrets that made even the familiar castle feel strange. George was young, but not too young to recognize when adults were worried. He had learned to read the small signs, his father's distracted expressions, his mother's too bright smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. On Sunday afternoon, he found them in the small sitting room, bent over old letters spread across a coffee table. They spoke in voices barely above whispers, unaware that he stood in the doorway. He heard fragments, words like hidden and Victorian era, and no records. His mother mentioned a painting. His father said something about duty and impossible choices. George cleared his throat and both parents jumped. He asked them what they were looking at, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. William and Kate exchanged glances. How much should they tell him? He was still so young. But he was also perceptive, intelligent beyond his years. Lying would only make him more curious. Kate gestured for him to sit beside her. She explained carefully, choosing simple words. They had found something old beneath the castle, letters and paintings from long ago, a mystery about people who had been forgotten by history. George leaned forward, fascinated. He asked if it was like a treasure hunt. William smiled despite his worry. In a way, yes. But this treasure raised questions rather than providing answers. Questions about their family, about the past, about secrets that had stayed buried for over a century. The boy studied the letters on the table, though the old-fashioned handwriting remained difficult for him to read. He asked why someone would hide letters and paintings. Kate felt her throat tighten. She told him that sometimes people made difficult choices to protect the ones they loved. Sometimes keeping secrets felt like the only way to keep everyone safe. George considered this with the serious expression he wore when thinking deeply about something. He asked if the secrets stopped being necessary when everyone from that time had passed away. The question hung in the air, so simple yet so profound. William found himself without an answer. That evening, after George had gone to bed, William returned to the library alone. One letter remained unread, thicker than the others, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the same, but the tone felt different. Final, deliberate. The writer addressed this letter to someone in the future, not by name but by title, the rightful heir. Someone from their bloodline who would one day find the hidden chamber and discover the truth they had buried. William read slowly, his heart beating faster with each line. The writer explained they had no choice but to hide what they treasured most. Society's rules, the demands of the crown, the weight of duty, all made it impossible to acknowledge the truth publicly. But they could not destroy it either. Love would not permit such erasure. So they built the chamber, preserved the evidence, left clues for someone wise enough to find them and brave enough to seek the truth. Edward the Unnamed. Prince George could not stop thinking about the boy in the painting. Those eyes followed him through his dreams, sad and knowing, as if waiting for something only George could give. Days passed, but the image stayed with him. A boy dressed in royal clothes, hidden away like a shameful secret. Someone who should have mattered, but somehow didn't. At least not in any history book George had ever read. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, he wandered into the castle library with his mother. Kate had brought him here to find books for his studies, but George felt drawn to the older sections, where leather spines cracked with age and dust motes danced in the gray light. His fingers traced along the shelves until they stopped at a thin volume bound in faded green cloth. The title had worn away almost completely, but he could just make out the words, Windsor's Hidden Spaces. He pulled it free and carried it to a reading table. Kate looked up from her own book and smiled at his choice. She always encouraged his curiosity about the castle's history. George opened the cover carefully. The pages felt brittle, as if they might crumble under his touch. The book described secret passages, forgotten rooms, architectural mysteries that had puzzled historians for generations. He turned pages slowly, studying diagrams of walls that held hidden doors and staircases that led nowhere. Then something slipped from between two pages and fluttered to the table. A sketch. His breath caught. Even before he picked it up, he recognized the face. The same boy from the portrait stared back at him, rendered in pencil on yellowed paper. The drawing showed less detail than the painting, but captured the same expression, the same slight sadness in the eyes. George called to his mother, his voice tight with excitement. Kate crossed the room quickly and looked over his shoulder. The sketch made her freeze. She had spent hours studying that painted face, and here it appeared again, hidden in a random library book like a message waiting to be discovered. She turned the sketch over with trembling hands. On the back, written in the same elegant script from the secret letters, were 3 words, Edward the Unnamed. But the Unnamed felt like an erasure itself, a title that acknowledged existence while denying identity. Kate felt cold spread through her chest. Someone had wanted this boy remembered, but only in whispers, in hidden sketches and sealed chambers. They had given him a name while simultaneously taking it away. She told George they needed to show this to his father immediately. But George remained sitting, staring at the sketch with an expression Kate had never quite seen on his young face before. Something beyond curiosity, something that looked almost like grief. He spoke softly, his words barely audible above the rain. "He looks lonely, Mummy." The simple observation hit Kate harder than any historical revelation. George saw past the mystery and the intrigue to the heart of it. A child, alone, forgotten by everyone except whoever had loved him enough to hide these traces of his existence. She sat beside her son and pulled him close. She told him that yes, Edward probably had been lonely. Whatever circumstances led to his hiding, they must have been terribly difficult for everyone involved. George asked if they could help Edward somehow, even though he lived so long ago. Kate felt tears prick her eyes. She explained that perhaps discovering the truth was a way of helping. By finding these hidden pieces and putting them together, they were giving Edward something he never had in life: recognition, acknowledgement that he mattered. The boy nodded slowly, still studying the sketch as if trying to understand the person behind those penciled lines. That night, the storm arrived. William and Kate lay awake, listening to the tempest rage outside their windows. Neither could sleep. The discovery of Edward's name had opened new questions rather than answering old ones. Who was he really? Why had he been hidden? And why did finding him feel less like solving a mystery and more like awakening something that had been sleeping? A crack of thunder shook the walls so hard that pictures rattled in their frames. Then they heard it, a sharp sound from down the hall, glass breaking. William grabbed his robe and rushed toward the sound, Kate following close behind. They knew before they reached the room what they would find, the chamber where they had stored the painting. William pushed open the door. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the portrait in stark white light. The boy's face stared out at them, but now a crack ran down the glass covering, splitting the image directly through the middle, a perfect line from top to bottom dividing Edward's face in two. No other glass in the room had broken. No other painting showed damage. Just this one, cracked during the exact moment when thunder shook the castle. They thought the storm destroyed the painting, not knowing it was about to expose more. Stay with us. The room behind the books. The electricians arrived to repair damage from the storm. Lightning had struck somewhere near the old library, knocking out power to an entire wing of the castle. They worked with flashlights and voltage meters, tracing wires through walls that had stood for centuries. One electrician pressed his hand against the library wall, feeling for heat or damaged circuits. The panel felt loose under his palm. He pushed harder, and something shifted. A section of the wall moved inward with a grinding sound. Everyone stopped working. The electrician shone his light through the gap. Darkness waited beyond, and the smell of very old air drifted out like breath. Within an hour, William stood before the opening with palace officials and historians. Another hidden space, another secret that the castle had kept locked away until circumstance forced it open. They widened the gap and stepped inside. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, but every surface held treasures. Shelves lined the walls, packed with leather-bound diaries and journals. A small desk sat in the corner, its surface still holding dried ink in a crystal well. Candle stubs remained in their holders, never fully burned. And in the center of the room sat a wooden chest, its lid sealed with wax that bore a royal crest. William moved through the space slowly, trying to imagine who had used this hidden study, who had written in these journals by candlelight, knowing no one could ever see them working here. A historian began examining the diaries, opening them with careful hands. The dates ranged across several years in the late 1800s. The handwriting matched the letters signed with E. The same person had written here, documenting something they could not share with the world. William knelt beside the chest. The seal looked official, important. He broke it carefully and lifted the lid. Papers filled the interior, organized in neat bundles. Architectural drawings, lists of supplies, schedules and lesson plans, all centered around something labeled at the top of each page, Secret Education Chamber. He spread the papers across the desk, piecing together their meaning. Someone had designed a complete schoolroom, hidden somewhere in the castle, a place where a child could learn reading and mathematics, history and languages, all without being seen by anyone outside a small, trusted circle. The notes included details about tutors sworn to secrecy, books purchased through intermediaries, special arrangements for everything a growing boy would need to develop his mind while remaining invisible to the world. One document explained why, in painfully clear language. The historian read it aloud, her voice catching on certain phrases. The child had been born from a forbidden romance, two people who loved each other deeply but could never acknowledge that love publicly. One of royal blood, the other unsuitable by the harsh standards of Victorian society. Their son carried that impossibility in his existence, proof of love that broke unwritten rules, a child who should not exist according to the rigid boundaries that governed royal life. So they hid him, not out of shame, but out of protection. Hiding became the only way to keep him safe, to keep both his parents safe, to prevent scandal that would destroy multiple lives. Edward the Unnamed had been hidden beneath the castle, so he could remain close to those who loved him most. That evening, King Charles met with William in his private study. The weight of the discoveries pressed heavily on both men. The king spoke quietly about the burden that crown and duty placed on those who wore it. He explained that royal life had always demanded sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice meant giving up personal desires for the good of the monarchy. Sometimes it meant denying love itself. William listened, hearing the pain behind his father's words. Charles was not just speaking about the past. He was speaking about every generation that had struggled with the same impossible choices. The king acknowledged that times had changed, that modern sensibilities allowed more freedom than the rigid Victorian era. But the fundamental tension remained: personal happiness versus public duty, love versus obligation. Edward had been caught in that tension and lost everything because of it. Later that night, William sat alone with the final diary. This one had been at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in cloth as if it held special significance. He opened it carefully. The entries were brief, written by someone recording moments they knew they could never speak of aloud. Descriptions of a bright child learning to read, a boy who loved stories about knights and adventures, someone who asked difficult questions about why he could not play outside, why he could not meet other children, why everything in his life remained secret. And through it all, the desperate love of someone trying to make an impossible situation bearable. A boy who understands. George had been quiet for 3 days. His parents recognized the signs. Their son was thinking deeply about something, turning it over in his mind the way he did with puzzles he could not quite solve. At breakfast on Thursday, he finally spoke. He asked if he could see the hidden chamber, the place where Edward's belongings had been kept all those years. William and Kate exchanged glances across the table. They had been protecting George from the sadder parts of the story, unsure how much a child his age should carry. But looking at his serious face, they realized he already carried it. The knowledge had settled into him, and keeping him away would not lighten that weight. Kate told him they would go that afternoon. The descent into the tunnels felt different this time. George held his mother's hand tightly, his other hand trailing along the cool stone walls. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and their footsteps echoed in the darkness beyond the lamplight. When they reached the chamber, George stopped at the threshold. The painting stood on an easel where it had been placed for study, the crack down its glass catching the light like a scar. He approached slowly, as if meeting someone he had known only in dreams. Up close, the boy in the portrait seemed even more real. The artist had captured incredible detail, every fold in the expensive fabric, every strand of hair, the slight shine in eyes that held both intelligence and sadness. George studied the painting in silence while the adults watched him. King Charles had come as well, wanting to be present when his grandson saw the chamber for the first time. He stood near the back, observing quietly. Minutes passed. George leaned closer to the portrait, his young face intense with concentration. Then he pointed to something small on the painted boy's collar. He asked what the symbol meant. Everyone moved closer. In all their examinations of the painting, no one had paid attention to the tiny emblem on Edward's formal jacket. It was so small, barely larger than a button, easily overlooked among all the other details. But George had seen it, and more than that, he recognized it. He pulled a small toy crown from his pocket, one of his favorite possessions that he carried everywhere. On its side, worked into the cheap metal, was the same symbol. A circle with 2 overlapping hearts, surrounded by what looked like small crowns or perhaps flower petals. The historians rushed forward with magnifying glasses, comparing the 2 symbols. They were identical, but what did it mean? One historian disappeared into another room where they had been cataloging items from the chamber. She returned, carrying an old book, its pages marked with strips of fabric. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it to a specific section. She explained that she had seen this symbol before while researching the secret letters. It appeared in several documents from the Victorian era, always in connection with a specific branch of the royal family. A branch that had been deliberately removed from official genealogies. The emblem represented something that the rigid Victorian establishment had found dangerous: unity between heart and duty. The idea that love and obligation did not have to be enemies. That the crown could acknowledge both personal feeling and public responsibility. But that philosophy had threatened those who believed duty required complete sacrifice of personal desires. So the symbol had been erased from official use. The family branch associated with it had been quietly edited out of records. Their philosophy is buried along with their names. Edward had worn that symbol on his collar, a silent declaration of what he represented, the child of love that duty said should not exist, living proof that heart and crown could coexist, if only society would allow it. George listened to all of this with an expression far too old for his years. He turned back to the painting, staring at Edward's face with an intensity that made the adults uncomfortable. Then his eyes filled with tears. Kate moved to comfort him, but he spoke before she could reach him. His voice came out small and broken, each word weighted with feeling he did not yet have the vocabulary to fully express. He said softly that Edward had just wanted to belong. That was all. Just to be part of the family that he could see, but never truly join. The simple truth of it struck everyone in the chamber like a physical blow. All the complicated history, all the social rules and royal protocols, all the impossible choices, they had reduced to this. A child who wanted to belong and was denied that basic human need. George's tears fell freely now. He wiped at them with his sleeve, still staring at the painting. He talked about how Edward must have heard his family above him, walking through the castle halls, how he must have watched from hidden windows as they lived lives he could never be part of, how lonely that must have felt, being so close to love but separated by walls he did not build and rules he did not make. Kate knelt beside her son and pulled him close. She felt her own eyes burning. William turned away, his jaw tight. The historians busied themselves with papers, but several wiped at their faces. King Charles stood very still near the back of the chamber. His grandson's words had found something deep inside him, some place where his own sacrifices lived, the prices he had paid for duty and crown. His shoulders shook slightly. He turned away to hide his tears, but everyone had already seen them. After several minutes, Kate suggested they should leave. This had been enough for one day. George needed fresh air and sunlight, not these underground shadows and century-old grief. They gathered their belongings and moved toward the door. George walked slowly, reluctant to leave Edward alone again in the darkness. At the threshold, he turned back for one final look at the painting. George drew in a sharp breath. The moment passed as quickly as it came, the light shifting, the illusion fading. But he had seen it. He was certain. He whispered something too quiet for the others to hear, a promise which he intended to make sure he fulfills, maybe not immediately, but definitely. 2 princes, 1 heart. The meeting room fell silent as King Charles entered. Senior historians lined one side of the long table, their faces grave with the weight of what they had discovered. Royal advisors occupied the other side, clutching folders thick with documentation. Prince William and Princess Kate sat near the end, while Prince George remained with his grandmother, unaware of the decision being made. Charles took his place at the head of the table. For a long moment, he simply looked at the faces around him. These were the people who guarded royal history, who maintained the careful narratives that shaped public understanding of the monarchy. Today, he would ask them to change that narrative. He began by acknowledging what they all knew. The discovery beneath the castle had revealed a truth that previous generations had chosen to bury. A child born of love that society deemed inappropriate. A boy denied his birthright, his name, his place in history because the rules of his time valued appearance over humanity. The historians shifted uncomfortably. They knew where this was going. Charles continued, explaining that the crown had evolved. Modern values recognized that the rigid cruelty of Victorian social standards had caused immeasurable harm. Hiding Edward had protected certain sensibilities, but it had also perpetuated the idea that some lives mattered less than others, that some love was shameful simply because it crossed artificial boundaries. He announced his decision clearly, leaving no room for debate. Edward the Unnamed would be restored to the royal archives. His story would be acknowledged officially as part of Windsor's history, not hidden in footnotes or whispered about in private, but documented properly with the dignity he had been denied in life. The room remained quiet, then one elderly historian spoke, her voice careful. She asked about the implications, about how the public might react to learning that the royal family had hidden a child for over a century. Charles met her eyes steadily. He explained that honesty, even difficult honesty, strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy. Admitting past mistakes showed growth. Acknowledging Edward's existence honored all those whose stories had been suppressed throughout history for similar reasons. William added his support, describing George's reaction to discovering Edward's story. His son had seen past protocols and politics to the simple human tragedy at the center, a child who just wanted to belong. If a young boy could understand that with such clarity, surely the institution could as well. The historians began nodding slowly. One by one, they voiced their agreement. This was the right decision. Long overdue, but right. The transformation of the secret chamber took 3 months. Architects worked carefully to preserve its original character while making it accessible and safe. The hidden study behind the library became part of the space as well. The 2 rooms connected to show the full scope of Edward's hidden life. They filled the chamber with artifacts from the sealed boxes, his toys and books. The letters were signed by E, the architectural plans for his secret education. Everything that proved he had existed, that he had mattered to someone. But they expanded the purpose beyond just Edward. Historians researched and found other forgotten royal children throughout the centuries. Stillborn babies never officially recorded. Children who passed away young and were quietly erased from genealogies. Others were born in circumstances that society deemed unacceptable. The chamber became a remembrance room for all of them, a space acknowledging that royal history, like all history, contained gaps where people should have been. Lives that mattered but were never properly honored. They installed Edward's portrait in the center, the cracked glass left unrepaired. The fracture had become part of his story now, a visible reminder of how secrets were damaged, even as they were protected. On the day the chamber officially opened to the family, George stood before the portrait for a long time. His parents watched him, remembering his tears months earlier, how deeply he had felt Edward's loneliness. The room looked different now. Warm lighting replaced the cold shadows. Fresh flowers sat in vases on small tables. Information plaques told stories in clear, honest language. The space honored rather than hid. George turned to his parents, his young face serious but no longer sad. He spoke quietly, his words simple but profound. He said that now Edward would never be alone again. People would know about him. His story would be remembered. That mattered. Kate felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were different tears than before. George's innocence reminded her of something adults often forgot. Truth healed more than it hurt. Acknowledgement brought peace even to old wounds. Love expressed, even a century later, still counted as love. Charles joined them, placing his hand on George's shoulder. He told his grandson that he had taught them all something important, that seeing Edward's humanity first, before the complications and protocols, was the right instinct, the one they should have followed from the beginning. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and Windsor Castle settled into new rhythms. The chamber became a quiet space that family members visited when they needed perspective, when the weight of duty felt too heavy, when they wanted to remember what mattered most. The castle itself felt different, lighter somehow, as if releasing the secret had lifted a burden from the ancient stones themselves. The staff noticed it. Family members felt it. Even visitors who knew nothing of Edward sensed a certain peace in the air. One October afternoon, as golden light slanted through tall windows, William found George reading in the library. The same library where the sketch had been discovered, where everything had begun. William sat beside his son and waited until George looked up from his book. Then he spoke about that day in the chamber when George had cried, about how those tears had come from understanding something most adults forgot or chose to ignore. He told George that crying that day had shown wisdom beyond his years, that recognizing Edward's pain, feeling it as if it were his own, demonstrated the kind of empathy that made a good person, and someday, perhaps, a good king. William explained that power meant nothing without compassion, that duty without a heart became cruelty, that the crown's true strength came not from authority but from recognizing the humanity in everyone, even those the world tried to forget. George listened seriously, processing his father's words the way he processed everything important. Then he asked if they could visit Edward before dinner. They descended together into the chamber as evening approached. The setting sun found its way through small windows high in the walls, painting everything in warm amber light. George had brought a white rose from the castle gardens. He placed it carefully on the small table beneath Edward's portrait, his movements gentle and reverent. The evening light caught the cracked glass at a perfect angle. The fracture seemed to glow, and the interplay of light and shadow across the painted surface created an illusion of movement, of depth, of life. For just a moment, Edward's expression appeared to shift. The sadness in his eyes softened. The corners of his mouth turned upward ever so slightly. A smile, perhaps, or at least the echo of one. traveling across time to reach this moment of recognition and peace. George saw it. He drew in a quiet breath and smiled back. William saw it too. He stood behind his son, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder, both of them bearing witness to something that transcended explanation. A connection between two princes separated by more than a century but joined by understanding and compassion.